All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 21st Ecological Integration Symposium. For our last speaker, we have Dr. Joshua Lawler. Dr. Joshua Lawler is an associate and Denman professor of sustainable resource sciences in the School of Environmental and Forestry Sciences and the director of Nature and Health at the University of Washington. He received his bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College and his master's and doctoral degrees in ecology from Utah State University. Dr. Lawler is well known in landscape ecology and conservation biology. His interests include how anthropogenic factors affect species distributions, population dynamics, and community composition at regional and continental scales. His research is involved in investigating climate change on population and species distributions, exploring the landscape, patterns, effects on animal populations and communities, as well as climate change adaptations for natural and human systems. Some of his current work has also included investigating the connection between time spent in nature and mental and physical health. Today, Dr. Lawler will present Anticipating and Planning for Climate-Driven Species Movements.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all for having me. I'm glad to be with you, even if it's virtually and quarantined somewhere outside Seattle. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you and your families are all doing okay. So I am going to talk about how we can anticipate how species might move in response to climate change, and then how we can plan for that, how we can protect biodiversity in the face of those movements and those changes. And I'm going to start this, let's see. All right, I'm going to start this story about 15 years ago when I was a postdoc working with the Environmental Protection Agency and with the Nature Conservancy. And I was working on conservation planning or reserve selection and developing different algorithms to select areas to protect biodiversity. And about the same time that I realized, well, about the same time everybody else realized that climate change was going to move species around, I did as well, and realized that that had pretty serious implications for the kind of work that I was doing at the time. All those algorithms and all those plans to select areas to protect biodiversity might have to go out the window if the biodiversity we were trying to protect was going to move around. And so I set out to try to figure out how we could include those movements in the planning process and how could we could ensure that biodiversity was protected even in the face of climate change. And so some of the earliest studies that came out, some of the earliest were done by Camille Parmesan, who noted that butterflies were moving around in the Western US and in Europe as well. And then a whole host of studies came out showing that species were moving around. This is one that was done by the Audubon Society, where they used Christmas bird count data to look at shifts in the wintering distributions of birds in North America. They looked at about 305 species and found that roughly half of them had shifted their ranges to the north, and on average, they were shifting by about 56 kilometers to the north. But it wasn't only birds. Studies found shifts in other organisms as well. This was a study that was done by Malin Pinsky that looked at marine taxa and found that many of the marine taxa were moving around as well. And at first glance, looking at those black arrows on this map, one might say, well, they're not all moving poleward, and they don't seem to be moving in the way one might think they would in a changing climate. But when he dug deeper into those patterns, he found that many were moving towards areas where there's deeper water, colder currents. And so they were moving in ways that one might expect given climate change. But species aren't only moving latitudinally or longitudinally, they're also moving upward in elevation. And this last study I'm going to show you was done by Craig Moritz and colleagues. And they revisited a bunch of transects that were done by Joseph Grinnell at the turn of the century. And they tried to map the distributions, the elevational distributions of mammals. And this shows 28 different mammals all along the x-axis there, and then the bars represent the elevational range of their distributions. Anywhere that's green in these bars represents a potential elevational expansion in their distribution, and anywhere that's red represents a contraction. So those are changes between the two surveys. And what you see is that a number on the left of that chart showed an expansion, mostly upward in elevation. And then some right in the middle there with all the red show contractions at the lower elevations. And then all the bars to the right show little to no change at all. And so again, roughly half the species moving in the way we might expect given climate change. Some of them moving in the opposite direction one might expect, but again, roughly half of them moving. So the first half of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I did to look at, that my lab and I did, to look at how we might be able to project how species might be moving in the face of climate change. And these first studies I'm going to talk about all draw on a fairly simple modeling approach called species distribution modeling or climatic niche modeling, in which one tries to represent the climatic conditions that a species exists in today and project where those climatic conditions will be in the future. And so this is what the output of one of those types of models would look like. The light green area is where the model projects the climate will still be suitable in the future for the northern flying squirrel here. The pink area is where the model projects the climate might become unsuitable for the species. And then the darker green is where the model projects that it might become newly climatically suitable for the species. We did this kind of model. We built these models for about 3,000 birds, mammals, and amphibians in the Western Hemisphere. And we projected changes, built maps like this for 30 different climate change scenarios. The first thing we did was take all that information and look across those patterns, across all those species and all those climate change projections to see how much change we might expect in the vertebrate fauna. And this is a map of that projected potential change. And the darker the colors here, the larger percent turnover you'd expect in the vertebrate community in any given place. On average across this map, this is a mid to high range greenhouse gas emission scenario, one might expect about 38% change in any given place. Some of the areas in this map have change that's over 90%. So fairly large changes in some places. One of my students, Carrie Schloss, who now works for the Nature Conservancy in California, wanted to know if all the animals that we were looking at, if animals would actually be able to keep up with these changes. And so these models project these potential shifts in distributions, but are the animals going to be able to move fast enough over this roughly 100-year period to track those shifting climates? And so that's the question that Carrie asked. And she simply said, well, if the velocity of dispersal of the organism is, or the species, is greater than the velocity at which the climate is moving across the landscape, the species should be able to keep pace. And this idea of the velocity of the climate moving had just been published at the time. This is a map by Lawler et al. And you probably have seen these maps of climate velocities or velocities of different climatic factors. Basically, they estimate how quickly climatic conditions will be moving across the landscape and how fast one might have to move to keep up to the conditions in any given place. And so Carrie went about calculating dispersal distances and climate velocities for 493 mammals under 10 different climate change projections. And the way she calculated the velocity of climate change was a location-specific and species-specific calculation. So she took a location in the current distribution of a species and said, how far would the organism have to move? How far would an organism at that location have to move to get to the nearest suitable climatic condition in the future? And she measured that distance and then said, well, we're projecting 110 years out. So 500 kilometers divided by 110 years gives us a climate velocity for this species in this location of about 5.5 kilometers per year. You could do that for any place in the species' current distribution and come up with a whole set of climate velocities that vary by location for that given species. Now, a different species might occupy the same space, and the climate velocity for that species to keep up with the shifting climate could be quite different depending on where the range of that species is and what the projected future shift in its distribution is. So she calculated these species-specific, location-specific climate velocities. So for every grid cell, for every species in the Western Hemisphere. Then she had to come up with velocities at which the species could move. And she did that as a function of the distance of an average dispersal event, the number of potential dispersal opportunities, and then some estimate of variability. She estimated the dispersal of an average, the distance of an average dispersal event by taking estimates from the literature when she could, but for a lot of species, those estimates don't exist. And so she estimated them using a relationship between body size and dispersal distance. And she used different relationships for carnivores than she did for herbivores and omnivores. To estimate the number of dispersal opportunities, first of all, she assumed that these dispersal events were natal dispersal events. And so the number of dispersal opportunities was dependent on the gestation period, whether there's any seasonality to reproduction, and the age of first reproduction. And she took all this and divided it by that period again and got a dispersal velocity for each species.
Mm-mm. Do you think about rocks?
Somebody, maybe. Well, it's okay. We're good. All right. So then, what she did is for any location in the Western Hemisphere, she took the dispersal velocity for a given species and the projected climate velocity for that species in that location. She subtracted the two, and any time that the climate velocity was greater than dispersal velocity, it meant that that species couldn't keep up with climate change in that particular place. So she summarized that across all the species in each location and came up with an estimate of the percentage of species that wouldn't be able to keep up with climate change in a given place. And somebody's got their microphone on and we can hear a cute little kid who might be playing with some rocks.
If you have your microphone on, could you please mute? Otherwise, I can take the hostship back and.
It's okay. I'm surprised we haven't heard one of my kids yet, but I don't think we have. Okay, so this is a map of the percentage of species in any given place that might not be, percentage of mammals, of these 500 mammals, that might not be able to keep up with climate change. On average, across North and South America, it's about 8% of the species in any given place that wouldn't be able to keep up. And the estimate goes as high as 40% in some places. So what about those species that could keep up with climate change and the species that are going to move to try to keep up with climate change? We wanted to know how they were going to move across the landscape. Where would they go? Are there going to be particular routes that they might follow to get to more suitable climates? And that's the next question we asked in the next study I'm going to talk about. So to answer that question, we use these same models and we use them to try to figure out how the species would move, how individuals would move from the pink areas into the light or dark green areas, and how they would move from the light green areas into the darker green areas. And I'm sorry I changed colors on you, but this is the map of a range shift projection for a species in South America. And the purple is an area of potential contraction, and the green is an area of potential expansion. And then the orange area is an area where it's likely to remain suitable, right? area of stability. So we wanted to map those movements. And to do that, we used a connectivity modeling approach that's based on circuit theory, electrical circuit theory. And this approach basically treats the landscape as a circuit board. And every grid cell in the landscape is treated as a resistor and has a given resistance. And one then injects electricity, or you could think of them as organisms, into a certain place in the landscape and sets another portion of the landscape to ground and watches how the electrons or the organisms would flow through that landscape with differential resistance from one place to another. So we use this approach to model movement from these areas of contraction into areas that would be more suitable and into the areas potentially of expansion. And if we do that without any differential resistance, we would get these little, we'd get a pattern of movement. And so these arrows represent the amount of flow of electrons in the model or organisms that they represent in the landscape. But we know that the landscape isn't homogeneous and that there's differential resistance to movement for the organisms. And so we wanted to incorporate that into the process. What we did, because we were looking at, in this case, about 2,700 different species, it was unrealistic to come up with a resistance layer for each one. So we used the human influence index or the human footprint as an estimate of resistance. The human footprint or the human influence index is based on population density of people, distance to roads, nighttime lighting, land cover, and potentially one or two other things as well. But basically, in these maps, the area that's darker orange has more human impact, and the area that's lighter has less. We regridded the map to the 50-kilometer grid that we were using in these studies, and then we used it as a resistance layer. And so this is a map of that same range that I showed you before in South America. Now the dark blue has less human influence and the lighter blue has more. And if we run that connectivity model again, you see a slightly different pattern in those little arrows that tell you how much flow there is. So what we then did was we took these projections for these 2,700 species and we overlaid them. And we said, where across these species do we expect to see consistency in movement? And that gives us this map. And it's hard to see because it's so tiny, but those are tiny little arrows across North and South America. And the bigger the arrows, the more movement across species we're likely to see. And the redder those arrows, the more agreement there is in the direction of movement. So big red arrows mean agreement and lots of movement. And you'll see that there are two little gray boxes on that map, which I'm going to zoom into in this next slide. And so just as examples of these movements, you can see the red arrows on the map on the left, which shows movement down into the Pampas in Argentina, up into the Sierras de Cordoba, and up into the Andes Mountains. And then on the map on the right, you can see movement in the southeastern US, lots of movement up into the southern Appalachians and along the Appalachians to the north. And this is just a visualization that one of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy put together to visualize these arrows. And it's a little misleading in that each little sort of stream or streak you see is not the movement of an individual species. This is just taking those arrows, those magnitudes and vectors of movement, and translating them into something that is called a wind map. Meteorologists will take vectors, wind vectors, and velocities, and turn them into maps like this to produce a picture of how the wind's flowing. And so in this map, the blue are movements of birds, and the magenta represent movements of mammals, and the yellow represent movements of amphibians. All right, so that's the first half of the talk, and it addressed some of the ways in which we tried to project how species might be moving in the face of climate change, where they might be moving, how they might move. which ones might not be able to move. And the next half of the talk, I want to talk about how we might plan to address those movements. So what tools do we use to protect these species as they move around, or potentially to allow them to move? In 2009, Erica Zavaleta and Nicole Heller published a review paper that looked at 22 years of recommendations coming out of conservation papers that had all recommending how we address biodiversity in the face of climate change. What can we do to protect biodiversity as the climate changes? And I'm going to summarize the top 7 most cited recommendations or made recommendations over that time period. The first one, the most recommended thing, was to increase connectivity. Then to integrate climate change into the planning process, conservation planning processes. The third was to mitigate other threats. The fourth was to study biotic responses. The fifth was to intensively manage populations. The sixth was to use assisted migration, pick species up and move them to places they might need to go. And the seventh was to provide more preserves, more protected areas for species. And I'm going to talk about 3 of these in particular. I'm going to talk about some of the work we did to model connectivity in the face of climate change. I'm going to talk about adding protected areas, particularly protected areas that cover climatic refugia. And finally, I'm going to talk about the conservation planning process and how that could potentially be adapted. So the first study I'm going to talk about is focused on connectivity. And the connectivity modeling is generally done by looking at habitat where species exists and connecting that to another patch of habitat that a species either exists in or could exist in. And those connections are generally made, corridors or pathways, through areas that are more or less habitat, more or less current habitat, or they're a configuration of vegetation or the landscape that we know the animal can pass through. And this is probably going to be useful in the face of climate change, and it may even be necessary to do in the face of climate change, but it's not likely to be sufficient in terms of connectivity, because what it doesn't do is it doesn't connect what is habitat today to what is likely to be habitat in the future, but isn't habitat yet. And so basically we need a new way of modeling connectivity and a new way of planning for these movements that isn't the traditional connectivity mapping. Tristan Nunez, one of my master's students at the time, set about to come up with an approach to do that. And he proposed to link natural areas, so not specific habitat to any given species, but areas that were more natural than the rest of the landscape, to link them together, specifically to link warmer areas to slightly cooler areas, to make those linkages avoid human land use and human impacts on the landscape in general. And then to have those pathways also, those you can think of them as corridors or connectivity routes, to have them avoid steep climatic gradients. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these things to tell you how he did this. So to link the natural areas, first he had to identify what areas were more natural in the landscape. So this is a map of a similar map to that human footprint map I showed you. It's at a higher spatial resolution, and it's for the Pacific Northwest, mostly Washington, a little bit of Oregon, and BC are in there too. The redder the areas, the more human impact, the more human influence. And you can see Seattle on that map, the whole Puget Sound region. You can see Portland a little further south. All that orange to the east is agriculture in eastern Washington, a little bit in Oregon. So the bluer areas are the less impacted areas. And so Tristan identified some patches of more intact landscape, and then set about to link the slightly warmer, the warmer ones to slightly cooler ones. And he took the average temperature of each of those patches and set a threshold for which ones he would connect, and set about connecting them. So you can see the purple lines on there represent the patches, the connections he's going to make between those patches. All right, so the third step in his process was to make the connections avoid human land use. So this is that same map of landscape integrity or human footprint. And so he wanted the paths, those corridors, to avoid more impacted landscape. And so he did that and came up with these corridors. And all these little yellow lines, yellow reddish squiggles, are the pathways, the corridors that would connect these warmer to slightly cooler patches and avoid human land use, human impacts to the landscape as best as possible. All right. So the fourth step in this process is perhaps the most interesting. He proposed not to have these pathways cross steep climate gradients, because you can imagine if you're a species living on a cool mountain side or a cool mountain ridge, to get to a cooler location, you potentially are not going to want to drop down into a warm valley and make it all the way up to a higher mountain ridge. You'd preferably like to follow a climatic contour to get to a higher elevation without going through a warm area. And the same potentially goes for a species living in a warmer valley, needs to get to a cooler valley, but can't traverse a really cold ridge to get there. So these, and I know they look just like the last ones I showed you, but these are corridors connecting or connections between these patches that avoid steep climatic gradients. And to show you that they're different than the last ones I showed you, I'm just going to flip back to the last one. So those are the ones that avoid human land use. Those are the ones that avoid climatic corridors and human land use and corridor. You can see they're a little different. Okay, so the next map is he produced by integrating the two. So he wrote an algorithm that would connect these patches with routes that avoided both steep climatic gradients and human land uses and produce this set of potential corridors. Okay, so Tristan did that work a while ago. He's since completed his PhD at Berkeley and gone on to do other things. But I had a postdoc a while back who picked up that approach and modified it a bit and applied it to the whole US. And so the purple lines on here are those sort of climate gradient corridors that avoid human land use, connecting warmer to cooler patches of more intact landscape across the whole US. Jenny McGuire, this was the postdoc I'm talking about, then went on to ask a number of questions about how far organisms might be able to move through a network of these connected patches if they were indeed connected by these pathways, how far they might be able to move if they weren't connected. And I'm going to return to this map in a little bit. But I want to move on to talk about another tool that we've explored for protecting biodiversity in the face of climate change, and that's the idea of climatic refugia. And there are a number of different ways to define climatic refugia. The one I think that's most relevant for the refugia I'm going to talk about defines them as places where either the climate is not going to change that much and species can remain as the climate changes, or places that species will move to as the climate changes. So either way, they're places that species are going to be able to subsist as the climate changes, either by moving to them or because they can stay there. This is work that was done by my postdoc, Julia Mahalik, and she set out to map these climatic refugia across the across North America. And she defined them in terms of what one might call climate analogs. And she first took a large climate data set and summarized a whole bunch of different climate variables using a principal components analysis. And she took two of those principal components and used those to describe the climates in North America. The little grid on the left that you're looking at shows a bunch of different colors, blues, grays, greens. If you look at the focal cell, what she wanted to do is she wanted to say, I'm going to look at that climate and find all the analogous climates in the landscape today and then into the future. And so on that grid that you're looking at, all those light blue cells she defined as climate analogs and could identify them. Now, first issue that arises is what is a similar enough climate? What makes a climate similar enough to call it an analog? So one has to somehow have a threshold for determining when a set of climatic conditions is analogous to the climates you're looking at. And she did that by looking at across 4 different taxa and looking at the geographic distributions of amphibians, mammals, birds, and trees across the US, and looked at the set of climatic conditions, the breadth of the climatic conditions across their geographic ranges, and came up with average values using these principal components. And those numbers, which are meaningless except for using this modeling, represent the breadth of amphibians, distributions, and the climate breadth of these 3 other species on average. And so this gave her 2 thresholds to explore: a narrower definition of climate analogs based on what amphibians might experience, and a broader one that might be more applicable to mammals, birds, and trees. So using that, she could identify these potential analogs, climate analogs. And those are analogs in today's climate, but we can also look out into the future and say, where will those be? Where will those types of climates be in the future? You could so you could look at where these climate analogs shift to. She was interested not just in shifting climatic conditions, but in climatic conditions that were going to become rarer in the future. So if you find that a climate is shifting and it's also shrinking, there are going to be fewer of those types of climate, that type of climate available in the future. Those were the ones she labeled climate analogs. Now, in addition to having a threshold for what is considered a climate analog, she also wanted to set a threshold for how far out in space one looked for a climate analog from a given space, from a given place. And that's because individuals are only going to be able, species are only going to be able to move so far in a given time frame, as we talked about before. And so she wanted to set a limit to what was considered an analog spatially. And again, she did that. So she wanted to set a radius within which she'd search for analogs. And again, she considered these 5 taxonomic groups and looked at average dispersal distances for these, multiplied them out by the number of years that she was projecting, using projected changes for, and came up with 4 different thresholds, spatial thresholds or radii that she'd use to search for these analogs. And so she had 2 different thresholds for analogs and 4 different distances in which she was searching for analogs, which produces 8 potential sets of climatic refugia. She also wanted to look at different climatic projections. And so she took climate projections from 3 different models, one producing a projection of less, one of quite a bit more, and one of an intermediate amount of change. She wanted to look at analog, or rather look at refugia across 2 different time periods. And so now I'm going to show you those. She produced these at a 1 kilometer resolution and produced a map that looks like this for the analogs of the 2050s. So the green areas are places where there are mapped climate analogs, and the different shades of green represent the analogs from these different climatic projections. In general, the darker green ones are a subset of the lighter green ones. If we zoom into the Pacific Northwest, you can see that most of these refugia tend to be at higher elevations. And in fact, once you get to about 4,000 meters, everything's considered a refugia site. We can look further out into the 2080s, and you see that those sites are generally a subset of the ones from the 2050s, which is not surprising. As the climate continues to change, these refugia are sort of retreating upward in elevation. Although we do see some different patterns if you look to the higher latitudes. So she was interested, we were interested in to what degree these refugia were already protected and what might it take to protect them. And so she took a map of protected areas for North America and overlaid it on her refugia. And first of all, she found that the refugia themselves, the way she defined them, and again, this is only one way to define climatic refugia. There are several ways to do it, several ways to model them. But she found that about 12% of North America was occupied by refugia as the way she defined them. The protected areas she used covered about 10% of North America. But the protected areas covered 25% of the refugia. So they're disproportionately protecting the climate refugia. About 40% of those protected areas had some area within them that was labeled as climatic refugia. So the protected areas are doing a decent job of covering these refugia, but 75% of the refugia are still unprotected. So they're doing better than one might expect by chance, but there are still unprotected refugia. All right, so that brings me to the last study that I'm going to describe, and it brings us all the way full circle to where we started. So finally, we're asking the question of how we incorporate climate change into our conservation planning processes, and what does that mean when we do that? And so specifically in this last study, I'm going to talk about how accounting for climate change can affect the configuration of a reserve network and the cost of a reserve network, in this case for the US. And not surprisingly, given everything I've said in the last half hour or so, we're going to incorporate projected future species distributions into these conservation plans, into these networks of protected sites. We're going to incorporate climate corridors and climatic refugia. So we started by laying a 10-kilometer resolution grid over the US and treated each of those grid cells as a potential site where protection could occur. And we then looked at the places that were already protected, because our goal, what we were setting out to do, was we were setting out to augment the current level of protection provided by the current reserves across, so the current parks and reserves and protected areas across the US. So we took a map of protected areas and we overlaid that on our grid cells, and we decided that any grid cell that was at least 50% covered by a protected area, we would count that site, that 10-kilometer grid cell, as being protected, knowing that it isn't completely protected, but we made that assumption. That meant that some species in the US already had a fair amount of protection. We set a goal of protecting at least 1,000 hectares in each of 100 different sites for all of 2,200 or so species in the US. And that was birds, mammals, amphibians, and trees, for which we had data. Okay, so we've got sites, and we've got, we now know the degree to which those sites are protected, which we're going to count as already being protected and which we're not. We then wanted to estimate, we then set out to estimate the cost of purchasing 1,000 hectares in each of those sites. To do that, we used an estimate of land costs coming from an econometric model. And the map you're looking at isn't 10-kilometer cells, those are counties, but we use these data to populate those 10-kilometer cells and get an estimate of how much it might cost to purchase land in each of those sites. All right, so we now have grid cells with an estimated cost and with a degree of protection. And now we need to populate them with information about the species we want to protect. And so to do that, we modeled species distributions at a finer resolution, but using a different modeling approach, but still using species distribution models. We modeled the potential current distribution of, as I said, about 2,200 species. And then we modeled the projected potential future distribution of those species using 3 different climate change scenarios or climate change projections. And they were the same 3 climate change projections that we used for, or that Julia used for the refugia modeling that I showed you. So we looked at a bunch of different reserve selection scenarios, one in which we were just looking at the historic ranges of species, but several in which we were looking at protecting projected future ranges. Now, to protect the projected future range, we wanted to protect sites that were projected to have the species today and also projected to be suitable for the species in the future under all three climate change scenarios. So again, to be counted as a site that would protect species into the future, given these projections, the species had to be predicted to be there today and predicted to have suitability there under all three climate change scenarios into the future. Okay. To try to incorporate climate corridors into the conservation planning, we use that map that Jenny McGuire produced. And again, we overlaid the 10-kilometer grid. We measured the length of climate corridor in that 10-kilometer grid. And then we set a target of protecting at least 20% of the length of climate corridors in every major ecoregion in the US. And we did one other thing. We also tried to make sure that we tried to capture as much of a corridor as possible so that we weren't just taking little chunks of them, by requiring our reserve selection algorithm to take sites that had corridors that crossed their borders. And to do that, and I can explain how to do that. Well, to do that using the planning software we did, we had to use a boundary length modifier that basically penalized us for, or gave us a bonus for having sites that shared a corridor. And I can describe that better if anyone cares. Okay. So the last thing we wanted to include in this process were climatic refugia. And we again overlaid the grid on the US, that 10-kilometer grid on the refugia in the US. And we set the goal of protecting 100% of the refugia as projected across all three of the climate change scenarios. So a cell only counted as including refugia if it had refugia from all three of the climate change scenarios. Okay. To do the conservation planning, we used conservation planning software called MarkSan. And MarkSan is optimization software that, for our purposes, was trying to find a set of sites that captured all conservation targets for the lowest cost, so for the lowest price. And we attempted to build networks to meet 4 different objectives. So we built a set of 100 different networks for each of these. And the first was just based on historical species distribution. So if we want to augment the current reserve network by adding reserves to protect where species are today, what would that look like? That's the first one. The second one was to capture species where they are today and where they're likely to be in the future. The third one was capturing where they are today and where they're likely to be in the future, and capturing 10% of the length of those corridors in each of the ecoregions. And then the fourth one was to capture where the species are today, where they're likely to be in the future, those corridors, and then the climatic refugia across the US. All right, now I'm going to show you the results, the spatial results from those optimizations. And again, I said we built 100 networks for each of those goals, and then looked across those 100 and said, how often does a site show up in those 100 solutions or those 100 networks? And so in this map, this is for the current species distributions. This is adding to the current reserve network. The current reserve network's not on there, but this is adding to the current reserve network. And the darker those are, the blackest of those sites, are sites that showed up in all 100 of the solutions that we came up with, all 100 of the reserve networks we came up with. The lighter the gray, the less often they showed up. Right? And so you can think of it as the importance of the site for protecting the species. Okay, so That's what the map looks like, or this network would look like if we were just focused on protecting current species distributions. If we try to protect where they are, where the species are today, and where they're likely to be in the future, that map changes a bit. Most notably, there are more sites on that map, but there's also a shift in those sites as well, which I'll show you later. If we then go and add the corridors to that, you see that that map changes even more. Some areas becoming quite a bit more important, and again, more areas being added to the map. And then the last set of areas, as the last networks that I mentioned, had the refugia in it, and you can say that that again adds a bunch of sites to the map. Now I'm going to just flip backwards through there so you can see that it's a substantial change as we actually added those things. And then I'm going to show you one more map that shows you again how things are different between planning for today's biodiversity and planning for biodiversity in some ways that might help us address climate change. So the green areas on this map are areas that we wouldn't include if we were just basing our conservation planning on current species distributions. The pinker areas, and the darker they are, the more important they are for planning for today's biodiversity, and the less important they are for planning for biodiversity in the future. And so anywhere that's green or pink shows you the change in where we would be planning and where we would be putting our emphasis. I mentioned that we also wanted to look at cost. And the first thing I want you to do is not to pay too much attention to the absolute dollar cost. And there's several reasons we can get into why that's not going to be completely accurate, or why it's not going to be accurate. But what I do want you to pay attention to is the relative difference in the heights of these bars. And first of all, you'll notice that if we add just climate refugia and corridors to a network that protects current species, that's the second and the third bar from the left, it doesn't really cost that much more. When we attempt to protect the future species distributions as projected by these models, the cost jumps by about 59%. If we then add the corridors and the refugia on top of that, it only goes up another 18%. So it may not be that expensive to protect some of these elements of the landscape that could help us protect climate change. And it might be a little bit more expensive to do some of the other things. All right, so I'm now going to try to conclude all of that and make some fairly broad statements. First of all, we know that species are moving around in response to climate change. And we have an idea that in some places, some species are not going to likely be able to move fast enough to keep up with climate change. For those species that are going to move, there are likely to be routes that they're going to take, or there are going to likely be parts of the landscape where more species are going to be moving than others. And those places may be targets for connectivity corridors. They might be targets for stepping stone reserves, or potentially for highway underpasses or overpasses. They may be places we want to conserve and protect in the face of climate change. There are other tools we have in addition to connectivity, but in terms of connectivity, we know that we probably want to do that connectivity planning in a different way than we have in the past. And the work I showed you that Tristan did and that Jenny McGuire did, that's one way to plan for connectivity in the face of climate change that would allow species, potentially would allow species to move from areas they are now to areas they need to be in the future. There are a handful of other approaches that have come out recently where people have played with different modeling approaches and different data sets to see if they could figure out ways to plan for connectivity that would allow species to move in the face of climate change. Climatic refugia are likely to be useful in the face of climate change. Fortunately, many of those refugia are probably already protected because we have protected a lot of higher elevation areas that weren't so suitable for human habitation and for agriculture. And so by default, we've ended up protecting, at least in North America, we've ended up protecting some of those climatic refugia, but there are still a number we need to protect. And then finally, in that last study I showed you, it may not be that expensive to add at least some of these approaches to protecting biodiversity and changing climate to our conservation plans and to conservation at large spatial scales like this. But what is also evident is that if we are going to seriously try to address the fact that species are going to be moving around in response to climate change, we won't be able to use the reserve networks that we've been designing. We're going to have to design them so that they can address those movements, and we're going to specifically have to do that. Okay, and with that, I just want to thank all of my students and postdocs and collaborators who worked on those projects. I'll just repeat their names again for you: Carrie Schloss and Tristan Nunez, Jenny McGuire, Scott Rinnan, and Julia Mahalik. And with that, I'll take any questions if you've got them.
So if you have any questions, you can use the chat and I can read your question, or you can unmute your mic and you can ask your question. But thank you so much, Dr. Lawler, for that great talk. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Hi, Dr. Lawler. My name is Erin. I thank you for that great talk. I was curious, when you're looking at things like future climate and planning for future scenarios, how do you find the balance between things that are maybe like more proximate challenges to conservation that are going to be happening in the next 20 to 50 years, and then things maybe you're looking at your 100-year projections or your 150-year projections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that question is most important when you consider both the climate change threats and the non-climate change threats. Because probably what is still the largest threat to biodiversity is land use change and destruction of habitat and fragmentation of habitat, right? And if that were to continue at rates that it is in some parts of the world, it won't matter what climate change does because the species won't be there to experience it fully anyway. So I think there is that balance. There's the goal of protected areas. So the fact that we're doing spatial planning anyway means we're trying to protect these pieces of land, and that's generally to avoid that threat of land conversion. There are plenty of other things one would need to do to address not only the threat of land conversion, but other threats. But climate change is sort of being woven into that. So I think that's an example of where you've got to plan for more than one threat at once. And the main threat one's planning for in that type of conservation planning is land use change. Yeah, so you do have to balance them. You're right. You have to balance that more distant climate change impact with more immediate land use change and other impacts. Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. So it says, you mentioned you would explain why the actual dollar projections aren't accurate. Would you mind going into a little detail about that?
Sure. Yeah. So it turns out it's pretty hard to estimate how much land costs across the country. You'd think it would be easier with Zillow and other databases and all the land that's constantly being bought and sold. But until now, that's been pretty hard. So these econometric models attempt to estimate how much the land would cost based on potential returns from different uses of the landscape, whether that be agriculture or urban or other potential uses. And that gives you an estimate and a general estimate at a fairly broad scale. And you could see those data were for counties. The data are actually a little more finely resolved than for counties because they also are based on suitability for agriculture and land quality. But they don't take into account distance from a city or distance from a highway or other things that we know at a finer spatial scale are more important for land costs. So basically we know that those land cost projections are inaccurate and they're too broad. Like if one considered whole states, they might be a bit more accurate. And for the counties, they're likely accurate, but for particular pieces of land within the counties, they're not going to be very accurate. And I do know that I've got a colleague that's about to publish or soon will publish a data set for the US that has much more accurate estimates of land costs. And I think what he did was he tallied actual transaction costs from conservation deals across the US to come up with a model to project costs. And that should be more accurate. And I'm working with him to get him the data from that last study. And he wants to look at how much the outcomes would change with a more accurate data set on costs. So hopefully that answers that question.
We have,
sorry,
go ahead. You can continue.
No, I was just going to say there are other reasons as well, because some of the land one might be purchasing, even though it's not protected land, because we already counted for protected land, there's federal land in some of those 10-kilometer grid cells that didn't reach the level of protection we required to call it protected. And so one wouldn't potentially, maybe one wouldn't need to buy that land, but one would need to manage it in a certain way, or would need to, the costs would potentially be quite a bit lower. That's what I'm saying. Okay.
Another question is, how do you think the exponentially growing human population will affect these predictions? Is there a way to account for the growing land area required to sustain human life?
Yes, I guess is the answer to the second part of that. But yes, there are other things that are going to be changing at the same time that the climate's going to be changing. And the growing human population is going to, affect climate change, right? And so the more rapidly the population increases, the more emissions we're likely to have. So that's one potential effect. But you're right, the more people we have on the planet, the more food they're going to need to consume and the more space they likely will consume. And so ideally, if one's doing conservation planning, one's not going to just plan for the threat of climate change, but one would have good maps of projected land use change and where populations are going to be expanding and where there's going to be a demand for land, and having that threat as well. And we did some earlier work where we used past land use change as a predictor of the threat of future land use change. If you can add that into that conservation planning process, it would probably produce even more effective planning tools. That's a good question.
Just as we're waiting for more questions to either be typed or for someone to turn their mic on, if you do want to talk to Dr. Lawler in a little bit more detail about his work and a little bit more personally, we do have something called a Lunch and Learn. Jonna is probably going to post it again because every time I bring it up, she's able to put it in the chat for us. But you can pre-register to meet tomorrow during our lunchtime. But you have to pre-register to get the Zoom link and the password. It's not going to be open to the public. So make sure you register before tonight so you can get that Zoom link and password. Like I said, you'll get to speak with Dr. Lawler in more detail, as well as all of our other plenary speakers. But we do have another question. So it says, I may have missed it, but could these projected or protected areas be parks could there be any revenue streams that offset the cost of protection and land purchases?
Yes, I guess the short answer to that is yes. You could imagine ways that they could be parks. One could charge admission or something like that. But you could also imagine other potential payment schemes that had to do with ecosystem services, right? And so if these areas were also providing ecosystem services and we had a market for those ecosystem services, whether that was carbon sequestration or fresh water, clean water provision, you could imagine other potential ways to offset those costs if the markets for those ecosystem services existed. It's a good question. Yeah.
All right, do you have any more questions? I believe that's all. So like I said, you can talk more during our lunch and learn tomorrow. It's an informal hour, and we can just eat and chat. Again, thank you again, Dr. Lawler. And thank you for everyone participating today. I know it's much different than past years that we've done the symposium, but it's really great that we've had so much engagement.
Thank you all.
All right, and so tomorrow we will start again with our student talks. So grad students and undergrads will also have a poster session. So you're welcome to come to our virtual site. We'll start tomorrow at 9:30. All of the morning sessions will be accessible for you to enter. And you can check out our program book for specific talks, because there are going to be a couple going on at the same time, so you can choose which ones you want there. Thank you so much.